Hello readers, I'm David and today we're going to talk about 5 key ideas from Thomas Sowell's Culture Trilogy. So Thomas Sowell is a Chicago economist, but he's also written some history books that are interesting, a lot of cultural history specifically, and 3 of those history books that he wrote are known as the Culture Trilogy. So you've got Race and Culture, Migrations and Culture, and Conquests and Cultures. And these 3 books were written during the 90s, and together they're about, let's say, 1,000 pages or so. And you learn a lot of interesting history by reading these books, but there's also a lot of interesting conclusions you can draw from these cultural history books. So I thought I would pick out 5 key ideas you can take away from these 3 books. First key idea: many migrants have greatly contributed to the country's economic development around the world they went to, and they have often developed their industries. For example, in South America, agriculture there was often developed by immigrants, such as German migrants going to Argentina or Japanese migrants going to Brazil. Or you have, for example, Russian industrialization. Now, Russia industrialized quite quickly in the early 20th century, but that was because they brought in skilled migrants and foreign capital into their cities. So, for example, there were a bunch of Brits who developed industry in St. Petersburg. And even in the early Soviet Union, a lot of the industrialization took place with skilled Western labor. So from that you can take that migrants are often a key factor in contributing to your economic development as a country if you get the right ones. Key idea number 2. Malays in Singapore are richer than Malays in Malaysia. And what's different between Singapore and Malaysia? Singapore is a majority ethnic Chinese state where you have equality before the law. So there's no preferential treatment for Chinese people or Malays or for Indians there. While in Malaysia, you have affirmative action for ethnic Malays. And despite the fact that ethnic Malays are better treated than ethnic Chinese in Malaysia, Malays in Singapore have grown more wealthy in the past half century compared to Malays in Malaysia. So from that you could conclude that having equality before the law instead of having a preferential policy to help some downtrodden group is the best alternative. Key idea number 3. One of the reasons that Western Europe has developed quicker than Eastern Europe and also quicker than Africa is because Western Europe has a better geography and they have a better river system and coastline. Europe has a longer coastline than Africa, despite the fact that Africa is a much larger continent. And also, Western Europe's rivers are a lot more navigable than African rivers, and Western European rivers lead out to the seas, while Eastern European rivers lead out often to nowhere. Of course, navigable rivers facilitate trade, so that's why you've had a lot more trade in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe or Africa historically. And that's why Western Europe was the first region to develop quickly economically compared to Eastern Europe or Africa. Key idea number 4. Empires can actually contribute to local economic development of the people they've conquered. And that often happens when the conquerors are more advanced than the conquered people. So for example, the Romans, when they conquered England, they brought economic development there. And when the Romans withdrew from Britain, England actually went into a period of centuries-long economic decline. When the Soviet Union conquered Central Asia, they actually brought economic development to Central Asia. And Central Asia appreciated this so much that when the Soviet Union was getting ready to dissolve, the Central Asian republics didn't want to secede from the Soviet Union, unlike the more developed parts of the Soviet Empire, like the Baltic states, which is one of the reasons Central Asian republics have a lot more closer relations with Russia than the Eastern European countries, which were more developed than Russia. So that means that imperialism is not always bad economically. It can be bad, of course. The Mongols massacred a bunch of people, or you've had famines in India that may have been caused by the British Empire, but sometimes imperialism actually brings about economic development. Key idea number 5. How slaves around the world historically were treated had more to do with economics than morality. So slavery is often discussed as a moral issue, and that makes sense, of course, as it's an abhorrent, disgusting system to employ people. Nonetheless, how slaves were treated around the world had more to do with economic incentives than with the morality of slave owners. For example, the death rate for Caribbean slaves was a lot higher than for North American slaves. And there were two main reasons for this. One, the Caribbean is closer to Africa than North America is, so it's cheaper to transport slaves to the Caribbean than to North America, which makes slaves more expendable, which makes it less likely for a slave to survive in the Caribbean than in North America. Second reason, the Caribbean slave owners actually lived in London. They did not live on the spot in the Caribbean. So the guy in charge of the Caribbean slave plantations was the overseer. And of course, the overseer has an incentive to get as much short-term economic gain as possible, which makes him work his slaves harder and which increases the death rate of slaves. In contrast to this, the slave owners in North America were usually living in North America, and they were more interested in the long-term sustainability of the slave plantations, which meant that they worked slaves a little less hard, which decreased the death rate there. Of course, from this we can draw the lesson that if you want to get people to change their behavior, it's often better to try to incentivize them economically than to try to appeal to their morality. Because we can see from different slave systems, people are inherently self-interested and will do first what's best for them, regardless of the consequences for others, often. So those were 5 ideas from Thomas Sowell's Culture Trilogy. I definitely recommend you to read these 3 books: Race and Culture, Migrations and Culture, and Conquests and Culture. And if you want to learn more about these books, then you can click on this playlist here, where I have reviewed all 3 of these books by Thomas Sowell. Otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.